Hi everyone. Today our goal is to learn how to do mini lessons to teach students how to insert dialogue into their stories, both their fiction and their nonfiction stories, in order to make their stories come to life even more. And so the big question really to start is why should we use dialogue? Well, as readers and as writers, we know that dialogue makes writing more exciting, and that stories that include dialogue tend to be faster paced, more enjoyable. The writing comes to life a little bit more. We feel more connected to the characters because we understand what they're thinking, what they're feeling, how they're acting. We know that stories with dialogue help to create suspense and action. And we know that stories that use dialogue help us to connect with the characters because we kind of get a feel for their voice. So even our young writers have a lot of expectations put on them, and by as early as second grade, really, students are expected to use their author's voice while writing. And adding dialogue is a great way to help students develop that voice, even in the younger grades. Now, simply encouraging students to use dialogue is not enough because writing dialogue is very challenging. And to take that risk without really knowing how to do it or without having a clear understanding of what dialogue is could be really hard for students. And so what we need to do is we need to plan and execute mini lessons that really can help prepare our students to use dialogue in meaningful ways. And what we'll look at today is we'll look at how mentor texts and coding existing drafts are two strategies that can really help students to effectively add dialogue into their writing. And what we'll do is we're going to use the SCAMPER model in order to plan and execute our mini lessons. The SCAMPER model was talked about in the book Writing Strategies for All Primary Students, written by Janet Richards and Cynthia Lasande. And in Chapter 2, they really go in depth of what this model is. This is a model for how to plan and execute mini lessons. And by doing all of these steps, we can really feel confident that our mini lessons are going to be effective. And so for me, the first part really is to know where your students are, what they can already do, especially with dialogue. So survey and assess their writing and talk to them about what they're already doing. The second part is to actually plan and execute the mini lesson with good materials and then modeling the strategies. The third part is really about student practice with us, students trying this on their own, and then reflecting how successful they were. And so we're going to apply this to mini lessons about dialogue. The first thing that we'll need to do is to survey and assess where our students actually are and what they're actually doing. And so I used two examples, the top one by Max and the bottom one by a student writer. And if I were to look at Max's writing, I could see, well, Max is actually using dialogue. I see examples of characters talking to one another, and I see examples of quotation marks. So I already know that Max is inserting dialogue into his story. With the second author, I can see that this author is trying to add dialogue because I can read, "Then Therese said, I wish I could go there." But I do notice that even though it has a tag, it doesn't actually use quotation marks. And so this information is helpful to know, well, Max needs a different mini lesson than my other writer does. And so how I would find this evidence is I would talk with students. I would maybe look over their shoulder as they're writing. I might pull some student notebooks to kind of see where they are. And then after I've done that, I would actually talk to students about their writing. And so the big idea is that you really, even if you look at their writing and you see evidence of dialogue, are they purposefully putting it in there? What are their intentions? Why are they doing that? And so really, work with some small groups, pull a couple pieces of their writing, and talk to them about how and why they're already using dialogue. And we do this for two reasons. One is that we want to make sure our mini lessons start at the right spot. We don't want a mini lesson where students already know how to do what we're trying to teach, and we don't want to go too far ahead of where they are. The second thing is, by knowing where students are, we can really already build on their strengths, and that will help them to feel more confident as writers. So these are sample charts that I actually got from the book, Writing Strategies for All Primary Students. And on the left, we can see a blank template. And this is a great template because the dialogue is actually coded for you. And so you can record student names and what ways they're already using dialogue. And this is filled in for us on the right, where we can see this teacher has really looked at Natalie and Javier's writing and can identify what they're already doing and taking some notes so that we know what mini lesson Natalie needs and what lesson Javier needs. So before we go on and actually talk about mini lessons and how to do mini lessons, I want us to think. If we had to categorize our students into groups, who do we think would be the ones who are already using dialogue? Well, then think about what ways can we really push them forward? How can we make their writing even stronger? And then think of students who are maybe attempting to use dialogue or trying it in different ways. What lessons do they need in order to be effectively using dialogue in their writing? And so now we get to the mini lesson part. Before we start, we have to get our stuff together. And so the biggest thing for step 3, especially with dialogue, is that we need to choose books that include strong dialogue. And these examples on the right are all examples of text with strong dialogue. And these were recommended again from the book Writing Strategies for All Primary Students. And I really recommend that we use texts that have pages with dialogue and pages without dialogue so that we can point out the differences for our students. And then finally, we are going to want to model the strategy that we want students to start using. So for our writers who are starting off with dialogue, it might be important to actually point out what dialogue is. So using a read aloud to show what are the examples of dialogue, doing a think aloud about how the dialogue really brings the story to life, and then giving students picture books or having them use their own independent reading books to point out examples of where the characters talk to one another. In partners, you can also do this, and this is great because in partners, you can have students look for examples, but then talk to one another to see, well, how does this dialogue really improve the story? How does it make the story even better? And that will help them starting to think both as readers and as writers. If your students already have a strong grasp on what dialogue is, then maybe the mini lessons would be actually using dialogue. So showing students where we should insert, when we can insert dialogue, how to actually add in that dialogue, and then obviously how to punctuate the dialogue correctly. And so these are 2 mini lessons. The first mini lesson I would do if students needed to know what dialogue was. And so in Henry's Freedom Box, the story actually starts off without dialogue. And I would read the page and I would explain that this page doesn't have any dialogue because even though the author is describing what's happening, the 2 characters, the master and Henry, are not talking to one another. And I don't see any examples of Henry saying something or the master saying something. But then as the story goes on, the characters start to talk with one another. And I would actually point out the example with the quotation mark showing this character is talking and the quotation mark starts what they're saying and the end quotation mark stops what they're saying. And so I'd actually point out the examples and then let students help on subsequent pages point out examples of dialogue as well. Now on this next clip, this actually is a clip that I got from Learn Zillen. And in this clip, a teacher is teaching students how to insert dialogue into the text.
In this lesson, we're going to go through the following steps. 1. Look for places when characters are talking. 2. Write down exactly what the character said. And 3. Put it in quotation marks. So in this lesson, we're going to use the following writing excerpt. It's responding to a prompt about cafeteria surprise. The principal has come into the classroom and announced there's a surprise in the cafeteria. And my job in this story was to write a story that tells what happens next. And here's the beginning of that story. The principal quietly came into our classroom to tell us there was a surprise in the cafeteria. We lined up and our teacher, with a wide smile on her face, led us to the cafeteria. Rosie, waving her hand wildly, asked what the surprise was. First, the teacher was quiet. Next, she stopped to tell us that the President of the United States was visiting us today. Wow. So who do we have talking in this story? Well, we have the principal telling us there's a surprise. We have Rosie asking what the surprise was, and we have the teacher who stops to tell us about the surprise. In this example, I'm going to provide a dialogue for the principal, and I encourage you on your own to go back through and think about what the dialogue might be for Rosie and the teacher. So I'm thinking, okay, the principal quietly came into our classroom to tell us there was a surprise in the cafeteria. And I'm thinking, what would my principal really come in and say? What would that sound like? And I'm going to go ahead and add that piece to my story. So here we go. I've added, boys and girls, there is a special guest waiting for you in the cafeteria. I think that's something my principal would say, so that's how I've chosen to write her lines here. Okay, boys and girls, there is a special guest waiting for you in the cafeteria. But I'm not done yet. There's a third step. I need to make sure I add quotation marks to the beginning and the end of the direct quotation of what the person is saying, of the dialogue. So before boys and after cafeteria, I've gone back in and added my quotations.
And so what we saw that teacher just do is how to model adding in dialogue based on what the character might say. So in that example, it was the principal. Another way to get students to add dialogue into the writing is to actually code their existing drafts. And what I mean is that with the student, reread the draft and look for spots of action and circle spots in the draft where there's really good action. And then think about, well, how can we add dialogue? What would the character say with that action? And so what I actually did with my 6th graders was I used this teacher model. And in this teacher model, it's about me going fishing in the Florida Keys. And what I did was I actually read the whole the story, and we circled parts that had action. So the first part I circled was that Casey promised he would cast for me so long as I baited my own hook. And so what I taught students to do then is, well, instead of me telling the reader that Casey promised me to do this, I actually made Casey say this to me. And so my dialogue over here is, I promise I'll cast for you if you bait your own hook. And then the second part was me actually putting the fish on the hook, the bait fish. And so I circled the second part over here, and I added the dialogue, ooh, I said, that's pretty gross, because that was my reaction to having to bait my own hook. And so after you've modeled your mini lesson and introduced those key strategies that students can use, you need to have them practice with you so that they can get a lot of immediate feedback from you to see how is it going. Once you feel like they have practiced enough with you, you're going to have them try to do this by themselves. And I like how step 6 and step 7 go together, because as students practice in their own writing, they're also going to be evaluating the effectiveness. How did it go? And they can be going back and forth, practicing and trying something out, and then evaluating either on their own or with a partner to see, well, how did it go? And making changes as needed. Now, before we go any further, I want us to think, based on the SCAMPER model, what students do we think that would really work for? And so I want us to make a quick chart which shows which students these strategies would work for independently, maybe which of our students need some more support, some more help or scaffolds, and then which students actually probably need to be pushed further because they already have a really good grasp on dialogue. And then I also want us to consider our limited English proficiency students who also need scaffolds in order to be able to use dialogue in their writing.